There we go, and we're recording. So I just wanted, that was my first announcement to let you all know that this is being recorded. This is the second session of the spring semester Colloquium Series sponsored by the Program on Education Policy and Governance. I'm currently an academic visitor here at the Kennedy School, working with Paul Peterson and Marty West to organize this session. And I'm happy to be here today and have all of you present. At the moment, we've got 5 more sessions that are confirmed during the spring semester in March and April on a variety of important topics featuring some really outstanding scholars. So please check the PEPG website. There's also, for those in the room, there's a flyer that sort of tells you when and who is speaking. Our next session is next Thursday, March 9th. And it's featuring Dr. Sean Doherty of Boston College, who will be discussing career technical education in a session entitled How to Make Technical Education Pay. So hopefully all of you and others who might be interested will participate in that as well. The topic for today's session is the impact of school busing on racial integration and educational outcomes in Boston and New York City. I'm obviously, coming from Massachusetts and Boston, a little more familiar with the situation here. But as many of you know, busing dates back to the 1974 decision by Judge Arthur Garrity, which, as a reminder, would have been 20 years after Brown versus Board of Education, in order to remedy persistent segregation in the Boston public schools as a result of policy decisions that were made by the Boston School Committee related to enrollment zones and student assignment policies and school construction and a variety of other things. And although the form has changed in large and small ways over the course of time, the busing of students across the city still continues to this day. Importantly, the rationale for that has been broadened to incorporate things like greater parental choice and better access to higher performing or higher quality schools. And by way of context, in the current fiscal year, the city and the school department is spending $50 million, a little more than $50 million on their so-called controlled choice transportation line item. And that's on a budget of total budget of about $1.5 billion. The question, of course, as we approach the 50th anniversary of Judge Garrity's decision is, has it worked? And I think actually a more relevant question is it working today, given the fact that the city and the school district are very different places than they were back in the mid-1970s. And we're lucky today to be joined by Dr. Parag Pathak, who has just completed an in-depth research project to answer that question. Dr. Pathak is a professor of economics at MIT and founder of MIT's Blueprint Labs, which is focused on education, human capital, and income distribution. Besides the work he has done in Boston and New York City, he has also helped to design school choice and student assignment systems in places like New Orleans, Chicago, Denver, and Washington, D.C. After his presentation, hopefully we'll have time for questions and answer and discussion. Even though we'll give priority to folks in the room in order to sort of get that off the ground, we'll also be monitoring the chat. And so folks online who have questions or comments, please put them in the chat and we'll try to work them into the conversation as best we can. And with that, it's my privilege to turn it over to Parag.
Well, thanks. Well, thank you very much, Jim, for that introduction. I think we first met in 2011. I was looking back at our notes, so it's great to be reunited and be back at Harvard, actually. And I'm thrilled to tell you about this project that we've called Still Worth the Trip, School Busing Effects in Boston and New York. And this is a project joined with my longtime collaborator, Josh Angrith at MIT, Guthrie Graylow, who's a postdoc at the University of Chicago, our student Clemence Edu, who's an assistant professor at Wharton, and let me just jump right into it. If you guys have any questions as I go, just stop me at any point, okay? I have far too much material in these slides and I'll have time to get into today. So if there are things you want me to take a deeper dive into, I can. So let me set the stage today by first kind of giving a little bit of background on busing. So Jim talked a little bit about the history in Boston, and I'll say a little bit more about that, but when we talk about busing, it's kind of American education policy vernacular for attending school outside of your neighborhood. Okay. And where I grew up in upstate New York, I simply went to the school down the street. There was no choice. But in many large U.S. cities, there are many schools close by, and students increasingly have the option to attend schools outside of the neighborhood. Now, school transportation often involves a bus ride, and it may be imposed by courts or districts in pursuit of racial balance. And a couple of years ago, these ideas entered the mainstream discussion in the Democratic presidential debate. Then Senator Kamala Harris mentioned that she was bused. She said there was a little girl in California who was part of the second class to integrate her public schools, and she was bused to school every day. That little girl was me. A little bit closer to home, busing has been a constant source of debate in Boston. There's a picture that some of you have likely seen before, but it's a picture that I've been thinking about for the 20 years that I've worked with Boston Public Schools on student assignment issues. This is a picture that was taken down in Government Center 20 years after the American Revolution in 1976. The title of this picture is called "A Soiling of Old Glory." It's a Pulitzer Prize-winning photograph. And there's a picture of a gentleman who's about to get impaled by the American flag, Ted Landsmark. Okay. He indeed does get impaled by the American flag, and Landsmark will come back to play an important role in our story here. The debate in Boston for busing began right around that time in the 1970s and continues to the current era. Now, when we think about research on busing, there is a large research in social science identifying the benefits and costs of court-mandated busing, particularly in the 1960s and 70s. So a kind of quick summary of that literature is there's pretty compelling evidence that court-mandated busing in the 60s and 70s improved educational outcomes for affected minority students. So a very nice book by Rucker Johnson summarizes that evidence. And at the same time, there's evidence that court-mandated busing accelerated white flight from central business districts, central urban cores. So that was the 60s and 70s, and what we're interested in this project is thinking about busing today. And by and large, busing today is no longer court ordered. There's a very small number of exceptions where districts have consent decrees, but those typically don't exist anymore. And busing still involves publicly funding travel to a non-neighborhood school, either by a traditional yellow school bus or by via mass transit. And busing is pervasive in urban districts that have district-wide assignment schemes. That's something that our lab has worked on quite a bit with districts with these choice plans. And even though busing is voluntary, the option to travel may still facilitate minority attendance at integrated and perhaps higher quality schools, or perhaps not. And this is what we want to take a look at today. And Jim already alluded to the facts in Boston about transportation costs. These are always quite stunning to me. Transportation costs associated with busing are growing. And anyone who opens the Boston Globe up in the morning will see a story of issues with school bus transportation, either strikes or near strikes or driver shortages. Just to put some numbers on that, here is a table of figures we put together using data from the NCES survey of the top 100 school districts in the US on per pupil transportation expenditures. From 1997 on the left here up to the right, 2017. And what you see here is Boston and New York stand out. In fact, Boston in 2017 is spending more on student transportation in this data series than any other district in the country. Okay, so it's more than $2,000 per pupil. Now, not all of this is due to the choice plan in Boston. There's many other factors. Regulations are quite complex, so Boston also agrees to transport students to parochial schools. The city also transports students to charter schools. There's also been a growth in transportation to special neat programming, IEP type programming. So that's a bit behind some of this growth, but it's still noteworthy just how much Boston spends on transportation. And so what we want to do in this paper, okay, is ask 3 questions. We're going to look at applicants in Boston and New York's choice systems. And for those who are randomly assigned to travel and opting to do so, we'll first look at whether travel enhances integration. Does it change the school environment for students who decide to leave their neighborhood? Second, we'll ask whether travel affects learning and college going. So we can measure learning through standardized assessments and college going using data from the National Student Clearinghouse. And our third question, foreshadowing where we're headed, is going to try to explain why we don't find much by way of education effects. Okay, so what is it that explains the mostly absent education effects? How are we going to do this? So the way that we're going to proceed is by taking advantage of naturally occurring experiments in the choice systems in Boston and New York City. So this is work that we've been doing for over a decade. Josh and I, together with co-authors like Attila Bilkadaroglu. The idea here is to try to use a choice algorithm and think of it as a stratified randomized trial. There are applicants who get into a school and those who don't by virtue of tie breaking, and that's experiment can be used to isolate very well controlled comparisons between students who got to travel randomly and those who did not. And lastly, let me just mention, looking at modern era research on non-neighborhood school assignment, there's a couple of related projects. So Dave Deming, who's at the Kennedy School, is a pioneer on these issues as well. So he's done a lot of work looking at Charlotte Mecklenburg's choice system. And there's some other work by a team looking at New York City. I think where we stand out is the leverage we're getting from the centralized choice systems, the research design that we're pursuing. Okay, so let me briefly tell you about the history in Boston. It's not a brief history. And Jim already mentioned the Morgan decision, so he saved me a little bit of time. For those of you who are not as familiar with the history in Boston, because of the Morgan decision, the state, Garrity ordered BPS to implement the state's racial balance plan. And so Garrity had the ability to come up with a system. What he did in the 70s is he took Boston and divided it into 867 geocodes. Okay, those still exist today, actually, 50 years later, and partitioned the city into 8 different districts. And in the initial Garrity plan, students were assigned to schools based on what geocode they lived in. That told you what district you were in, and schools were balanced across these districts. Okay. Now, as Jim mentioned, this system has been tweaked with many times in the intervening years. In the early 1980s, Boston adopted control choice. It was one of the first districts to adopt a control choice plan. Actually, Cambridge, Massachusetts is arguably the first place to ever do this. This is the idea is instead of forced busing, we're going to allow applicants a choice on where they get to attend while still aspiring to have racial balance across the school. So that's the control choice piece here. And Chuck Willey, who was at the Ed School here at Harvard, was instrumental in designing the system that Boston used in the 1980s. My involvement with the Boston choice system began in the 2000s when I was a graduate student here actually at Harvard. At the time, Ted Landsmark, the gentleman in the picture that I showed you earlier, who was getting impaled by the American flag, led a task force to think about changing zone configurations in Boston. Okay, and as part of that conversation, several stakeholders entertained the idea of eliminating the choice system entirely and going back to neighborhood schools. Okay. At that time, the only thing the Landsmark task force could get to an agreement on was actually changing the actual mechanics of the assignment algorithm. Okay, and in part because of their recommendation and some subsequent work, In 2005, then Superintendent Paisant agreed and recommended to the school committee that Boston should use a different assignment algorithm that's known as the deferred acceptance algorithm. Okay. And Boston was a pioneering district in doing this. This is now used in districts all over the country, the deferred acceptance algorithm. So it's a magical algorithm with remarkable properties, but I'll tell you about this some other time. Okay, so come to my class if you want to learn about that. So that's a quick kind of summary of the Boston history. New York is a little bit different. So Boston, heavy court involvements, supervision by Garrity, very controversial figure. In New York, on the other hand, it's a story of voluntary integration by and large. So New York City schools have long been seen as emblematic of de facto segregation. In the 1960s, there were mass walkouts of schools. Voluntary integration efforts took place in the 1980s and 90s, different educational models, ideas to try to mix together children. And in the 2000s, in the Bloomberg-Klein era, there was centralized control of the district schools. So decentralized community control gave way to the high school choice process. Like Boston, actually just 2 years before Boston, New York also moved to a single offer deferred acceptance algorithm-based assignment system. If we fast forward to the kind of recent couple of years in New York City, a lot of the discussions are about kind of a tale of two cities. So the New York City School District has many schools that are basically able to self-segregate through their admissions priorities. Okay, so the way they do that is, for instance, at the iconic exam school, it's test-based admissions. Okay? And there are a handful of screened, I should say more than a handful, roughly a third of high schools use some kind of screening criteria in New York City. So a big effort in New York City during the de Blasio administration was to de-screen high schools and more available to city students, regardless of where they live. Okay, and our co-author Clemence has some work on some of these more recent efforts, so it's quite exciting. So let me jump ahead and get into some of the data and the research design. And so just a couple of key points about the data. So the data that we're working with is a mix of data that Boston Public Schools has generously allowed us to study, and the state has allowed us to study. You know, Massachusetts is quite remarkable in how willing they are to allow researchers to study education topics using administrative data. It's one reason why we know so much about Massachusetts schools compared to other places. So the data that we get from Boston are the information from the choice system. So that's information about student demographics, their geocode, where they applied, and test score information. So our test score outcomes are all going to be from the MCAS system. So this is the high stakes test taken in grades 3 through 8. For the purposes of our study, when I talk about a baseline score for middle school applicants, I'm talking about 4th grade, that's the baseline. And for high school applicants, I'm talking about the 8th grade scores. Okay. When we talk about outcomes for middle school kids, I'm thinking 6th and 7th outcomes on the MCAS and 10th grade outcomes for high school. And as I mentioned a second ago, we also have the National Student Clearinghouse data set. So that's kind of the gold standard data on college enrollment, and that's coming to us from the State Department of Education. Every test score I'm going to talk about today is going to be in a standardized unit. So the standard deviation will be 1, and we do that standardization within BPS enrolled students. The New York data layout is pretty similar. Okay, so there's no state data in New York; it's all coming from the city. And the test scores that we're going to focus on in New York are SATs. Okay, and we also have the National Student Clearinghouse files. I see there's a chat request here. Is that?
Yeah, ignore it.
Oh, okay, great. Sorry. Okay, great. So just a couple of descriptive facts, and then we'll get to the meat of the analysis. So, you know, Boston is like many large Northeast urban school districts. It's heavily Black and Hispanic. So you can see that in the first column here, 43% of 6th and 9th grade students in Boston are Black, 34% are Hispanic. About 3/4 of students qualify for a subsidized school meal. And the one thing I want to draw your attention to in the first column is the rows about charter and exam schools. So this study is not really about choice to charters or to exam schools. We're mostly concentrated on choice within the traditional district schools. And you can see that if you go all the way to the fourth column, where we zoom in on the experimental sample. Okay, so this is the group of applicants who are subject to some kind of risk of assignment. That is, they are part of a natural experiment in the assignment mechanism. And 9% of those actually enroll in a charter school, and only 4% enroll in exam school. Now, we have outcomes for those kids because they're in the state files, but most of what we're talking about is movement within the traditional public schools in Boston. The last thing I'll point out in this table is the characteristics of the experimental sample are fairly similar to those that are enrolled in Boston public schools. So if you look at their racial makeup, it's slightly more Black and Hispanic, slightly less white or Asian. And their baseline scores tend to be a little bit lower. So that's here in right down here. Again, baseline scores are standardized to have mean zeros. So the reason for that is students who have opted to go to an exam school are not part of our experimental sample. Those who apply to an exam school, they tend to have higher baseline scores. So when we take them out, the mean baseline scores are a little bit lower. Okay, that's Boston. New York City, just like Boston, heavily minority district. So more Hispanics than Blacks, 40% in column 1. And just like in Boston, we're not really talking about charters and exam schools. So let me skip ahead. Okay, now, so that's our data sample here. Let me tell you briefly about how we measure distance and travel. Okay, so we have two concepts for measuring distance and travel. One is a discrete indicator, so whether you're in the zone or out of the zone. In Boston, the way we do that is through what we call the Garrity walk zone indicator. So the way it works in Boston is if I reside in a geocode that is within 1 mile of my elementary school, I'm not eligible for bus transportation. Okay, so what they do is they have this map. Actually, I think we have the map here. This is what the map of Boston looks like. Okay, so these are all the geocodes. So let's say we took Tech Boston Academy. Okay, so we draw a circle around it. And if my geocode intersects with that circle, then I am inside the walk zone. Otherwise, I'm outside of the walk zone. Okay, so that's how we're going to define the zones in Boston. In New York City, the district is divided into 32 districts, sub-districts. And so we will define you as attending a school outside of your home district if you're in a school that's in one of these different 32 districts. Okay, so that's the discrete measure of distance, in or out of zone. The continuous measure of distance is computed using a API, that here public transit API. So we kind of set this off and computed travel times for all of our sample, assuming kids are traveling at 8 a.m. on Monday, January 31st in 2022. So the specific details are in Boston, we look at the time from your geocode centroid to your school building coordinates. And in New York City, we're looking at the time from your census tract, the kid to the school building coordinates. We don't have access to the actual bus routes in either of these cities. Something I glossed over in both of these cities, you can take the bus, but you can also be eligible for public transportation. Now, we experimented with various ways to measure travel. So I think the kind of conclusion from those experiments is that what we're really doing is just scaling our effects by a different number of minutes or number of miles. And what I'm going to show you is essentially unchanged. So it's not that sensitive to how we exactly measure travel. Okay. All right, so with those measures defined, let me show you just a couple of quick facts about travel for kids in Boston. So For Boston, if you just focus on the enrolled sample, so that's again the first column here. About 77% of applicants are enrolling in a non-neighborhood school. Again, we're looking at middle and high school applicants. Our estimate is the travel time is about 33 minutes to your school. It's 3.63 miles away, okay, and about 71% of applicants are eligible for busing. Okay. In New York City, the share of applicants who enroll in a non-neighborhood, but that would be an outside district school, it's about 64%. Slightly more travel in terms of time, 36 minutes, and distance 4.5 miles. And that's fairly similar with the enrolled sample and also the experimental sample, and that's true of those cities. Great. All right, so that's, yeah, please.
So just a question on the, like, how they're making these decisions.
Yeah.
Is there like an information component where they're getting a sense of like the outcomes of other schools? Like 40 minutes away seems quite far
Yeah.
to choose for a family. And so like, how are they making that choice?
They are, so they go through these choice processes, every city, every year. We just, I think, completed round one in Boston. You have to register your kid if you're in a transition grade. So let's say you're thinking about 6th grade or 9th grade. You, in Boston, currently you would go to a family resource center, or you would log in online. You type in your address, they would give you your menu of options, and then they would give you your placement a couple of months later. So the information that you have access to is information on the website there. They used to print school brochures. That was more common during our time period. And there's a host of other information that you can find on the web. Nowadays, when you go on the current Boston website, they even, because you type in your own address, they even give you explicit distance information. Say this is the miles. They don't give time information as far as I know. And they explain how you would get there. So some kids would take the subway, the T. In our time period, it was much coarser, actually. The brochures would just say, okay, this is, a school profile. New York City is pretty similar. So they have these thick school brochures in New York. They're 700 pages long. Kids typically get information from the middle school guidance counselor about their choice options, and then they submit a ranking of up to 12 choices. And then it goes through this algorithmic process.
And then just a quick follow-up. And there's no like selection into the schools, right? Like schools can't opt out of like the busing program.
So that's a great question. So let me start with New York City. So every single traditional public school in New York is part of the busing process. The charters are not. So the charters in New York run their own process. Now there's a couple of wrinkles in New York City. So if you wanted to apply to the exam schools in New York, like Stuyvesant or Bronx High School of Science, you have to go and take a test and go through a separate deadline. So that's like typically a month or two before you apply to the traditional mainstream schools. Boston's a little bit trickier because Boston has a handful of traditional public schools that are called pilot schools that operate outside of the choice process. So you might have heard of Fenway High School. That's a high school right by Fenway Park. And so they get to run their own admissions process, actually. The vast majority of schools are in the choice algorithm in Boston. The charters are not part of the system in Boston, just like in New York City. That's something we've worked on in other places. Actually, we've gotten some cities to get we call this unified admissions. So that's, the work in New Orleans, the work in Denver, Washington, DC, and Chicago are all cities where all of your application choices are on one form and you just submit a single application. But Boston and New York have not moved in that direction. Are there any other questions? Yeah, please.
I'm just wondering whether I know you don't have data, but I was wondering whether you looked at sort of adjacency and availability of private schools, because I wonder whether you might see sort of flight to private schools where they're available and whether that would like mediate peer effect.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a really hard question because you don't get administrative
Yeah.
data on private school applicants.
But I wonder whether you could sort of see the access and see whether
An amazing fact about Boston is something like upwards of 45% of the applicants to Boston Latin are applying from private school, right? So for the really selective schools, that's kind of the margin. If I don't get into the Latin, I'm going to private school. Now, Latin isn't part of this study, but none of the exam schools are part of this study. What we have actually is pretty good follow-up rates among students who are in our study. So if I don't get to one of my choice options, I tend to stay in the district.
Mhm.
And the reason for that is we're looking at people who are applying from the public schools to begin with. So once you condition on being already in public school, say in 5th grade, and you go through this process in Boston for 6th grade, if you don't get your first choice, you got your second choice, your third choice, you're very likely to stay in the district. So
What proportion of kids are going to private school in Boston?
in Boston overall?
Yeah.
I don't know the number off the top of my head. My guess would be about 15%.
Right.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
There used to be a very active Catholic school sector, especially in West Roxbury. I think that has decreased in size a little bit as the charter sector has grown.
Mhm.
Any other questions? Okay, terrific, great. All right, so here's what I'm gonna do. Okay, so I'm gonna just kind of set up a straw man, okay? This is what we call OLS benchmark. So OLS is short for ordinary least squares. This is kind of a simple regression, the simplest regression you would do. And then I'm gonna try to show you what we think of as our new and improved methodology to handle unobserved and observed differences between children who decided to travel and those who did not, the experiments. Okay, so let's start off with the OLS benchmarks. And how does this work? So we're just gonna have some outcome on the left-hand side of our regression. So that could either be a standardized test score or a measure of college enrollment. So those are dummy variables like did you enroll in a 2-year college or a 4-year college? Our treatment here is either did you enroll in a school outside of your neighborhood? Okay, so that's GI, out of your Garrity walk zone, or in New York, it's the district concept. Did you enroll out of your district? We also will be looking at model of travel time. So everything I'm going to show you for travel time is going to be in terms of 20-minute increments. Okay, and that's scaled to be roughly comparable to out of zone. Okay, so these can be compared to one another. And the regression is this very simple regression. Outcome on the left-hand side on this indicator for did you leave your zone? And we're going to control for everything that we can control for, okay? So that's demographic characteristics, whether you're an applicant in the match, and charter and exam school sector dummies, because we're interested in choice between traditional public schools, okay? And we're looking at all students in 6th and 9th grade in Boston and 9th grade for New York City, okay? And so here is the table of results. Just to simplify the presentation, I want to basically focus on Black students, okay? So that's column 2 for Boston and column 5 for New York. And the way to read this is if I leave my zone in Boston and I'm an African-American student in column 2, my MCAS scores are about 0.09 standard deviations higher, okay? So I'm doing better on those tests. And that's also similar for reading. So the ELA test, it's a 0.07. I'm more likely to go to any college. That's a 4.5% effect and a 3.5% effect on 4-year college. New York City also shows these positive effects of travel. Again, this is kind of a straw man. We haven't exploited the naturally occurring experiments yet, okay? But this is kind of what you might be able to expect in our data sample. You look at column 5 in New York, so it's about a 5 percentage point effect on SAT math and a little bit larger for reading and hints of a positive effect for 4-year college. One thing just to point out, we have a lot more data in New York City than in Boston. So even though we care a lot about Boston, we're able to say much more precise statements about New York City because we have a lot more data from New York City. Okay, so you can see that here by looking at the standard errors in these tables. So that's what's in the parentheses here. They tend to be much smaller universally, especially for the college outcomes in the New York estimates than the Boston experience. Yeah.
I might have just forgotten your equation, but right now we're just talking about whether you ever travel, like amount of time you might have gone. Like
That's right. This is just the 1-0 out of zone, in zone. And this is not adjusting for did you decide to apply? Were you really interested in traveling or not? We're just looking at where did you enroll? Did you enroll in or out of zone? So a challenge with these kinds of estimates is this challenge of selection bias, right? The types of kids who've decided to travel maybe differ in ways that we're not controlling for, okay? And so that's what we're going to try to address next, okay? And so I have some kind of technical notation here, but I don't know if this is a good use of time to go through that kind of stuff. Jim has already warned me that our MIT guys love our Greek letters. That's what our response was. So I'm going to try to give you like a high.
I'm sure they love it too, but we have time.
Of what we're trying to do. Okay, so the essence of the kind of research design here is we want to find two applicants in the choice algorithm, let's say in Boston, okay, that are applying to a school for which there's just one seat left over. Okay, so let's say Jim and I both want to go to school A. Okay. Now in Boston, who gets to go to that school A? So the way they do it is they have some priorities at school A. If we had a sibling at that school, you get in over kids who don't have a sibling. If you live near the school, you get in ahead of kids who don't live in near the school. So that in particular, if you're in the walk zone of the school, that's what I showed you a second ago, you get priority over kids who are not in the walk zone. Okay, and within those categories, they call a random number on a computer, and whoever's got the more favorable random number gets an offer. Okay, so what we have is this randomized trial that's conditional on the fact that we applied to school A and we have the same priority at school A. Okay, so if Jim and I both applied to school A and we both lived in the walk zone, the only thing at that stage that determines whether I got to go or Jim got to go is who's got the better random number. Okay, so this is a fairly elaborate, what we would call a stratified randomized trial, because the strata are where did I apply and what are my priorities at each of my choices. Okay. And so what we've been working on in the lab for a long time is how do we harness these experiments, what I just described to you, to be able to isolate and identify causal effects of school attendance, okay? We have a series of papers explaining how to do this. Just as a kind of advertising, we think this is incredibly powerful because these experiments are happening all over the country in every big city school district. So many questions of policy interest can be addressed using this methodology. And we think it's quite rigorous because we really have this randomized trial. Okay, so that's kind of all I wanted to tell you about this. Okay, so I see some of my lab mates here kind of chuckling because they've been deep in the weeds here. So I'm going to skip ahead on some of this notation here. And try to get to the results. Let me just briefly say a couple of things just about how our sample of kids narrows down to the sample of kids for which we have experiments. Okay, so the OLS benchmark that I showed you, if we look in Boston, let's just look at the first column here, sixth graders in Boston, about 48,000 kids. So the second row here, 48,000 sixth graders across the years of our study have geographic information, okay? And when we go to the study design that exploits these naturally occurring experiments, we start off with about 32,000 kids who are applying to school in the match, in the school choice process. We lose a chunk of them when we ask whether you are subject to assignment risk, okay? So a case where we cannot use our methodologies, if I apply to a school and I'm guaranteed assignment to the school, okay? Why can't we use our methodology? Because there's no experiment there, right? I'm gonna get in for sure, okay? So that's what we call that's what we would call degenerate risk. You're gonna get in for sure, okay? So the set of students who have non-degenerate risk, that's about 13,000 students. And then we lose a couple more when we ask whether you actually enroll in the school and whether we have outcomes for the kids, okay? So that's kind of the biggest place. Also in New York City, when we ask, are kids actually subject to a random assignment experiment? Okay, one of the really cool things about this methodology, I think, is you might think, okay, let's look at who's applied to the school as their first choice. Are there more first choice applicants than seats? If so, then we probably have an experiment, right? That's right, typically. But you can also have an experiment even if there's not more first choice applicants than seats. The school has 100 seats and there's only 50 people who ranked it first. The reason for that is some students could have ranked it second or third. And some of those students could get into that school randomly by being rejected from some higher rank or more preferred choice, okay? And so that's just scratching the surface a little bit of the power of the algorithm to create these experiments, something that we're really excited about. Okay. If there are no questions on that, let me just press ahead, okay, and tell you kind of the bottom line. And so I said, we're going to first talk about the integration consequences of leaving your neighborhood school. And then we'll turn to the education consequences, okay? So what I'm showing you in this table is the effect of leaving your neighborhood, so your non-neighborhood effect on the racial attributes of your classmates, okay? So again, we'll just focus on column 2 and column 5, the Black applicants. So the way to read this is for Black applicants in our study, about 50%, so the mean here is 50.5% of their peers are Black, right? And if I am enrolling by virtue of the assignment process and by being in our experiment, outside of my neighborhood school, my peer share decreases by 9 percentage points. Okay. Now the peer share Hispanic increases by about 6 percentage points. Oh, there's a question here. Yes, there's 2 questions. Why don't you go first, please?
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you in the mid-sentence.
That's okay.
I see you did this based on race or ethnicity. Did you do this based on disability as well?
We have not done disability.
Because all too often, what I have found is people find these topics a problem, but when it comes to disability, no problem, bust them off. Right? And so what I'm trying to understand, what's the difference?
I think the couple of things we could say. So the overall share of students in Boston.
By the way, it's not that I'm supporting, it's
No,
a
no, no.
rhetorical type of question. I'm
Understood,
trying to
yeah.
understand. I don't want to be like.
Yeah, I think there's the rationale for busing children with these special needs, I think is very different than the Garrity kind of story in Boston, right? So
Special needs
yeah.
isn't, so that's an antiquated term.
okay, sorry.
And really not politically correct, sorry. And the whole need for special needs is also antiquated.
Mhm.
So as a mother of a daughter with a hearing loss,
Yeah.
who quote, had a special need,
Mhm.
she graduated Brown with a 4.0.
Okay.
Right?
Mhm.
So she would, in most school districts, be considered special needs. First child to graduate Chapin, right? So with a hearing loss. So it's rethinking what a disability is,
Yeah.
where kids with disabilities need to be placed, and whether this whole busing thing works. So that's why I'm asking what the impact of this.
Yeah, we haven't looked at that. I was just going to say that the share of kids who are categorized in the state system in our sample, I think it's about 20% or so. So that would give us an upper bound on how much movement we would have by sending a kid out of the neighborhood or not. It can't be more than a 20% change. But that's kind of a different question that we haven't considered. There was another.
Parag, I know Paul's got his hand up, so if we figure out how to get him to allow him to ask his question.
Paul, if you can hear us, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes, actually, if you want to hold off responding to this question until you finish your presentation, that's fine, because it's more interpreting what you have than looking, at the screen here. So, but there's a new book out by Antero Garcia, who's at Stanford School of Education, entitled All Through the Town. I sort of really liked the title of that book because it reminded me of this little, the wheels go around. Wheels on the bus go round and round, all through the town. Pretty neat title. And so he describes how awful it is to ride on a bus. It never occurred to me just how awful it is to ride on a bus. And then I remembered, because I did ride on the buses, just not to school, but when we would go from one town to another to participate in athletic events and other things, extracurricular things. It was awful. So I wonder how much of what you're finding could actually be due to riding on a bus. But that's a question I think is best left till after you've finished your presentation.
Yeah, I will take that up. We have a way to think about that a little bit, Paul, so let me see if I can get to that, because it's definitely a great question. Let me continue here with what we have in terms of how the school environment has changed by virtue of leaving your neighborhood. What I want you to take away from this table is really the off diagonals of the table here, right? So Black students are less likely to attend schools with other Blacks, more likely to attend schools with Hispanics. And likewise for Hispanic students, they're less likely to attend schools with other Hispanic students and more likely to attend schools with Blacks. So we see that in Boston, and we also see that in New York City. So the Black applicants have fewer Black peers at their school, and Hispanic applicants have fewer Hispanic peers at their school. So that's the first two rows of this table. The last row of this table is a measure of minority isolation. Okay, so this is defined as attending a school with more than 90% Black or Hispanic peers in the grade and school enrolled. Why 90%? So that's a kind of a conventional threshold in the literature that other scholars have focused on. And here, Boston really stands out, I would say. So in column 2, again, for our Black applicants, if you leave your neighborhood, you are 16.5 percentage points less likely to attend a school that's categorized as minority isolated. And the overall mean is 43%. So that's a pretty large effect. Okay, so sometimes people worry about extreme segregation and use this 90% threshold. We don't see a similar pattern as extreme in New York City. Okay, so that's the pure mix exhibits. Now let's turn to the education consequences of distance and travel. The layout is always going to be Boston on the left, New York City on the right. And we'll first start off looking at non-neighborhood enrollment. So this is that 1-0 measure of did you leave your neighborhood? And in Boston, what you see is, let's say for Black applicants, again in column 2, fairly noisily estimated effects on MCAS math, nothing as large as the OLS estimates that we started with. Jumping down to college, leaving your neighborhood has relatively little effect on attending college, any college, and the four-year college result here is 0.047, but the standard error is 0.05, so we can distinguish this from a 0. New York City gives us a lot more power. As I mentioned, we have a lot more data in New York City. Here we can pretty confidently narrow our confidence intervals. For SAT math, not much going on in terms of benefits of leaving your neighborhood. For college, there's even some hints of negative effects of leaving your neighborhood. Okay, so for instance, if you look at Hispanic applicants, any college result is at -0.02%, so 2 percentage points less likely to go to college if you leave your neighborhood. When we rescale this using travel time, so this is that 20-minute increment, okay, we have a pretty similar picture as the discrete 1-0 increment. Some of our estimates are a little bit more precise, but that's a little bit hard to say rigorously because these are just different scalings. But here, you know, the negative results that I mentioned, for instance, for New York City, leaving your neighborhood for Hispanic applicants in New York City, 20 minutes of travel reduces college going by about 3 percentage points. And in Boston, none of the four-year college results are positive. Okay. Great. Okay, so that's kind of the second part here, right? So first part, there are positive integration effects of non-neighborhood school assignments. Second part, not much by way of achievement effects and college going effects, some hints of negative effects. What's behind this? And can I just do a quick time check, Jim? How are we doing?
We're getting pretty close.
Okay, pretty close.
If 5 minutes, could
5
you
minutes,
wrap up?
great,
That'd be
yeah,
great.
great. Okay, so here's what we're going to try to do next. Okay, so why doesn't busing matter? Okay, so close to Paul's question a little bit. We're going to propose a model for why busing doesn't matter, and that is a view that the only reason why schools should influence your achievement by virtue of travel is because of the effectiveness of the schools that you get to attend. So this channel that you're on the bus and you're not having time to do your homework, or you're on the bus and you're getting beat up, that was my story, is not what we're picking up here. Let's imagine that school travel effects are mediated by school quality. We have a way of measuring that using a value-added model. So we have kind of a new and improved way of doing that we call risk control value-added. And what you see is when you travel 20 minutes, how does that influence the value added at the school that you attend? Okay, and it turns out that it boosts it by a very, very small amount. Okay, so this is too small of a change to affect outcomes by very much. Okay, so we are not actually able to reject a model. Okay, and this is what I'll just gloss through very quickly. That attributes all differences in achievement to differences in value added. Okay, so the school that you attend, the value added at that school is the only reason why travel matters. So more complicated stories, we don't find much support for relative to the story that value added is the only reason that travel matters. Okay, so that's what we do in this section of the paper. Let me press ahead to get to the last part of the paper. I said Ted Landsmark plays an important role in our story, right? So remember the gentleman impaled by the American flag, the person in charge of the Landsmark task force in 2004. In 2009, Landsmark wrote an editorial in the Boston Globe that was titled, "It's Time to End Busing in Boston." Okay. And he says at the bottom, we can no longer afford to spend $72 million a year to bus children across Boston to schools that are not demonstrably better than schools near their homes. About 32 million will still be required to transport children with special needs. The other 40 million is the vestige of the 1970s court mandate that Boston rejects decades of racial discrimination in its schools. So in some sense, Landsmark has anticipated the findings that we have in this paper. We see that moving kids around doesn't influence the value added at schools that kids attend by very much, and there's very little by way of achievement effects. And so what I'll do with my last 2 minutes here is something a little bit more speculative, okay? And this is an attempt to try to imagine what the cities would look like if we had neighborhood school assignment, okay? So both my and Josh's kids attend neighborhood schools in the suburbs, and the question we want to look at in this last minute here is, what if we return to neighborhood schools in Boston and New York City? Okay. Now, this might save between $1,000 to $2,000 in per pupil expenditure. And if you take the best estimate from meta surveys on what one could do with $1,000 more for people spending, Kirabo Jackson has a survey with a student of his that could increase test scores by about 0.04 standard deviations, and college going by about 3 percentage points. People still quibble about this number. It's a very hard thing to identify. And so what we want to ask is, what would happen to segregation and minority isolation if we return back to neighborhood schools? Okay, so how are we going to do this? We're going to rerun the assignment process in Boston, assuming that students rank schools that are closest to their home, and neighborhood schools can accommodate the students in their catchment areas. So we take every school and say, let's find the maximum number of students that you've ever been assigned to, okay? This is our model of neighborhood assignment. What does this look like? Okay, so that is this last table here. Okay, so on the left, we have the baseline scenario. We're showing time and minority exposure, same race exposure and minority isolation. And on the right, we're showing what it would be like with neighborhood assignment. Now, I should emphasize, this is a bit crude because we're ignoring the fact that people might decide to leave the district if there was no choice, or maybe some families would return to the district if we had neighborhood schools. And the one thing that stands out here is that minority isolation for Black students is 43%. So again, that's extremely segregated school, 43%. That jumps by 10 percentage points if we went back to neighborhood school. Okay, so we would have this pretty dramatic increase in minority isolation for Boston's Black students. If you look at the other rows here, I would say the effects are far more modest in comparison in returning back to neighborhood schools in this simulation. So let me wrap up here. Okay, so what we've done in this project is to take a look at modern era school busing. And we found that there is a degree of integration, especially for Black students. I didn't spend as much time talking about Hispanic student enrollment, but there's been a dramatic increase in Hispanic students in both Boston and New York City. And for that group, there's less of an integration effect of busing. And despite this integration effect, we don't find much by way of subjective human capital dividend. So as Landsmark argued, the schools that travelers travel to are not much better than those that are nearby. Okay, so neighborhood schooling in Boston and New York City could free up instructional resources, and according to our estimates, it's unlikely to reduce learning, even with the resources unchanged. At the same time, it's likely to increase minority isolation, especially for Black Bostonians. And what we hope to have contributed in this paper is clarifying kind of this trade-off with the choice systems in these two cities. So let me stop there.
Great. Thank you. And we've got close to 20 minutes until the 1:15 hour. For those of you who might be able to stay a little longer, perhaps we can compel Parag by locking the door to keep him around a little bit for at least some informal conversation. One quick question just to kick us off is that this the outcome that educational results have not been significantly effective and maybe even slightly negative is, as you mentioned, is not surprising to the extent that the quality of schools and the range of quality or value add is pretty narrow. And maybe that's in the poor or mediocre range, but that the distinctions are not that great. So it's not all that surprising that going from one school to the next wouldn't make a big difference. I think there are two things that I'd be interested in whether you either looked at or have thought about or might look at in the future. One is around safety, and both measured in terms of incidents that might be reported to the state or to the city, but also in terms of suspensions and expulsions and things like that, and whether there's any sort of relevance there. The other is around resource allocation, because I think one of the things that certainly dating back to Brown and through to Garrity is, as much as we might like to think that an extra $1,000 produces an extra bonus in terms of educational outcomes, probably the most proximate concern was that some schools, in particular schools with high concentrations of low-income students and students of color, would be getting less and less is obviously a question about whether that's somehow equitably, if you will, calculated, but that students would in those schools would be getting less in terms of resources, both in terms of dollars as well as, for example, experienced teachers and things like that, than schools in other neighborhoods with wider populations or higher income populations. Do you look at that at all, or is that something that we could look at going forward?
Those are two fantastic questions. On the safety question first, so what we can measure in the administrative data sets that we have are suspensions and what we've constructed is a disciplinary index. So are you tardy? How many days are you tardy? Are you truant? And there's almost nothing going on either of those. So we don't think that's a big part of the story. Sometimes people say that I need to travel to get out of, my neighborhood. It's not very safe. And to measure that, you would want to know, safety incidents that kid has experienced. That's something that we don't have access to. So that's on the safety side. On the resource side, our impression is kind of in the modern era, especially in Boston, where they have a weighted student funding formula, which allocates based on student needs. There's not much difference by way of resources across schools using the traditional measures. So one thing that we do have in the paper is student-teacher ratios. So if I travel, am I more likely to have larger classes or smaller classes? and it goes the wrong way. So if I travel, I actually have larger classes. So it's a pretty small effect, but if I look at teacher experience, so this is also in the paper, almost no difference using the state's classification, percent of teachers that are licensed or teachers who are highly qualified. So the one way we're thinking about this 60s, 70s era busing, pretty impressive effects on education. And a big part of that story was resources, right? And, another big part of that was integration. What we have here, we think is essentially holding resources fixed and just looking at direct effects of integration. And that's why, the title of the paper is it still worth the trip? If we've mostly made a lot of progress on resource equalization in the current era. So that's how we.
So it could be, the way of thinking about it is that the gains, if you will, which may be measured mostly by more equitable resource allocation, happen very quickly or relatively short period of time. And now there's not much incremental value being added beyond that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm gonna preface my question because I know I have biases already. But I participated in busing, but thank you first for clarifying, because in my world, how we see busing is not even in Boston Public School at all. Like, we're just like, that's just transportation.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to rethink what busing could mean based on the group, because that wasn't even my perception when I walked through the door. So thank you for that. My main question is, what is next for your research? Because how I've experienced busing in my community, we're thinking 60 minutes out. Your research is 20 minutes out. And there's the famous program in Boston that I participated in, METCO, that has years of a waiting list. And these numbers I know would look different if we looked out 60 minutes, 45 minutes where we're going to school. So any interest in coming on this side to extend that a little bit?
So we have one of our graduate students who's now an assistant professor at Tufts is doing a ton of work with METCO.
Okay.
It's a great question. So what is METCO? METCO is a voluntary desegregation program in Massachusetts that what they called inter-district choice.
Yeah.
So everything we've been doing here is intra-district, so you're getting bused within the city. And the METCO program sends kids from Boston to suburban districts. And so the rides are much longer. And it's a very iconic program. And there's a long-standing social science question of the students who are graduates of the METCO program. Many of them feel like it was a life-changing event for them. But they were also positively selected, right? They had parents who knew how to navigate the admissions
Correct.
process, and they were also selected in the admissions process by.
And what you mentioned earlier about if you have a sibling in, you're more likely to get in.
Yeah.
So these variables, I'm like, oh my goodness, it's exactly, this could be duplicated.
Yeah. Yeah, so we don't know the answer to that
Okay.
kind of question yet,
Okay.
for the METCO one. Someone is working on it from our lab, and she's got, we will know that answer and come back in a couple of years.
Okay.
I will say one thing about METCO, because it's quite topical for folks here in Boston. There is some work that my co-author Josh has done looking at the effects of METCO's kids in suburban districts. So it's kind of the secondary question, if you will, not that a kid who went to METCO benefit, but what happens to the kids in the receiving districts by virtue of having more METCO kids? And he finds little effect on those receiving kids.
Okay.
So that's a paper that we cited actually here, Angrist and Kevin Lang. So they look at
Kevin, what's Kevin Levin?
Lang.
Thank you.
That's a study of Brookline Public Schools, which is one of the major receiving districts of METCO kids. I don't know who was next, so you were next. Okay, great.
I was wondering, and I know it might be harder to access in administrative data sets, but were you able to look at any non-cognitive effects of integration and busing? Because I think sometimes it's funny what does pop up, and like whether you have, is there effects on racial bias, people who are more fast, is there effects on behavioral?
Yeah.
I know you talked about discipline, but
It's really, we're kind of hampered by what we can measure. So
yeah,
if you go back to Brown, right, where Jim was talking about, like a big part of the narrative for Brown, right, was the famous experiments of Kenneth Clark and the dolls, and black girls think black dolls are evil, right? So these effects are very much on the top of mind for desegregation advocates, and we would love to be able to figure out how to measure those things in a systematic way. The only study that I've seen that has made some progress on this is studies looking at college roommate integration.
Yeah.
You know about this.
Looked at that in class.
Yeah, I think Dan Levy, I think.
Yes,
Yeah, right.
yeah.
So Dan's, that's kind of the best paper, I think,
Yeah.
on this topic. Almost nothing in the US K-12 sector on that. So the best we can do in terms of these non-cognitive outcomes are these behavioral disciplinary outcomes. And, people quibble about, is that really non-cognitive, or is that just measuring how strict the teacher was, whether you got suspended or not?
Thank you.
I was interested in like clarifying how you were measuring like the minority isolation and whether that was like school-wide population based and whether you saw indications of like true mixing. I'm thinking about like in New York, there has been a tendency of schools to like be desegregated. However, like creation of like honors or AP programs that tend to like create segregation. Schools.
Yeah, our measurement is fairly crude, so we're looking at the grade year. So if a school that's tracking, so that's like a New York City story, that's kind of the tale of two cities. Like if you want to get the AP classes, you can self-segregate and access that. We don't have the ability to know who's in your class. My read of the studies that have that kind of information. So I had a graduate student actually who did a very nice paper, I think it's Roman Zarate, where he convinced the Peruvian Ministry of Education to allow him to place students in their selective boarding schools however he wanted to, as part of a randomized control trial, actually. He sees very little evidence of moving people across income lines and having them be roommates versus not on achievement outcomes. Where he does see some evidence, so to your question, actually, are on social outcomes. Now it's Peru, it's kind of rural Peru, so how relevant that is for US schools, we never know. But that's all I know about that specific topic. Did you have a question? Yeah.
So I mean, this was making me think a lot about like moving to opportunity experiments in a sense, because you're like giving a voucher essentially, right, for like improving school quality. But I guess the fundamental question, and I think it'd just be helpful to understand more, is it's not clear that like parents were selecting on quality in this experiment.
Yeah.
Maybe that's why we don't see effects. I guess what are your thoughts on that? And like,
Yeah, so we have a set of papers advancing that view that parents rarely are selecting on quality. That could just be an intrinsic taste, or that could actually be just information. It's very hard to run the value-added model that we're doing here. And so, some folks have said, well, you don't really need to run the value-added model. There's decentralized information. We can kind of see what's a good school and what's not a good school. But across a range of studies, we haven't found much evidence in favor of the kind of so-called market on the demand side, at least working to influence choice. I mean, one kind of interesting fact that I glossed over here is in Boston, actually, Black applicants are traveling further to their school than Hispanic or white applicants. So perhaps they are more receptive to leaving their neighborhood. Now, for what reason? Is it the safety point, or is it performance levels, or performance quality? Parent pressure.
Yeah.
It's hard to tease that out, but I think there's a fair bit of evidence that the amount that parents put on quality is it's more they're putting on performance levels than quality in a value-added sense.
sorry, just two other questions, you know, like just quickly. One, can you just, I think you've kind of hinted at this already, but just curious, like how this kind of reconciles with the Rucker-Johnson work. I think you mentioned resources. I don't know if that's.
Yeah, I think the big difference, right? If you look at Rucker's book, right, it's like, he's very, the Children of the Dream is the name of this book. It's a very nice book. He's very much in favor of integration, and he says there should be a way to do this in the modern era, but he doesn't have an example where this has actually worked. So most of his work is looking, is the famous Jackson-Johnson paper, Rucker and Bowe's paper, is about resource equalization in the 60s and 70s. And, that's part of this, I think, consensus view that has had some pretty significant effects. But if you look now, in the last 2 decades, it's hard to find a specific example. I've asked Rucker, gave a seminar at MIT a couple of years ago, and I said, your book kind of ends with this optimistic message, like, is there any example? And he said, not quite. So there's kind of a couple of thoughts on that. Maybe we should move in that direction, right? And bring back resource equalization or even supplementation. And I think that's probably what Ruck would say if we were to ask him. Integration plus additional resources. So it's like what happened in the 60s and 70s. So that, yeah, that's how I see that. I think what we've done here is hold fixed, resources move, integration. Yeah, I think, sorry.
I think there's a strong argument that social capital is a really big factor in terms of helping low income students access opportunities they wouldn't normally have the potential to. And so I'm curious, I know you talked about like cognitive outcomes. Did you think at all about social capital and just exposure to people outside the neighborhood is being a positive effect?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the integration effects here are nothing that we should discard, right? So you know, when you think about that simulation where we say what would happen with neighborhood schools, there's this gigantic increase in minority isolation for Boston's Black kids, right? And that has consequences likely on things that maybe we're not able to measure easily here. So you know, again, I'm stuck with what I can measure, really, right? So I take your point. And you know what, the way we want to think about this is like there are these trade-offs, right? So on the one hand, depending on how much weight you put on the minority isolation results or the race mixing benefits of busing, that needs to be weighed against the cost of, you know, $2,000 per pupil. And that's a conversation we'd like the city to have, to be honest. Yeah.
Do you think you'd get a very different result if you had the power to like expand the busing like to Newton and Brookline in Boston or to Great Neck and Montclair in the New York metropolitan area?
I think that's the Metco question. I think we'll find out the answer to that hopefully in a couple of years with Elizabeth's work. It comes back to what Jim was saying early on, but you know, if you look at the standard deviation of value added within the Boston sector, you know, that range is about 0.15. So that's the standard deviation. So even if I bust you from the worst school to the best school, I'm moving that, you know, maybe by about 0.3, best case, say. And so you might have this view, and this is what we always debate at Blueprint in our lab, that the Newton schools are much better. And we don't really know if that's true because there's this huge selection issue in the Newton schools, a lot of highly educated, highly resourced parents. So for that reason, I don't know the answer to your question. Is it first really true that the schools in the suburbs are better in a value-added sense? I'm kind of skeptical. Just because we've seen even the most selective schools in the urban context tend to be stories of selection bias and not necessarily value added. And then there's the, you know, the other force. If you have such a big change in the school environment, that could actually backfire, right? So we sometimes hear that about Metco, right? Some kids are maybe hurt by the fact that they're going into such a different environment where they're the only minority kid. Like your Great Neck example, right? So great question. I wish we knew, and I think we have a strategy with one of our lab mates to get to that answer at some point.
Wait, it's the last question.
Quick question on your selection. You made a comment and you said, we're not putting in these students in the control study because they already know where they're going. How did you already know where they're going?
Yeah, so let me say that maybe more precisely. So the students that we can really say something rigorous about are those, by virtue of where they applied, are not going to get into a choice for certain. Okay, because they are, let's say, a sibling. If I'm applying as a sibling and my older brother's already at the school, I get in that school for sure.
Okay.
And I'm not subject to a coin flip because I'm always going to get that school. So there's no experiment for that kid. So that's why we lose a lot of that sample. And we can only focus on the kids that we have an experiment for. Fortunately, those kids look pretty similar to the overall pool of kids who've enrolled outside.
Did you determine who you were going to select? Like, did you make that
Unfortunately,
determination?
it's a consequence of method. So,
Okay.
you know, like you can think of it like this. Let's say we ran the assignment algorithm a bazillion times. There's going to be some kids who always get the same assignment. There's no experiment there, right? So that's what we're doing essentially.
So Parag, any closing words?
No, this is great. I love the questions. Thanks a lot for your interest. And yeah, I'm happy to stay after if there's other questions or comments.
Excellent, excellent. We'll lock the doors when you can't escape. But thank you so much again.